Thank you to everybody for coming today. It's lovely to see cameras on because I like to be able to see faces as well. So lots of you got your cameras on, which is great. My name's Siobhan MacLean. I've been a social worker for 35 years. I've been a practice teacher for 32 years. I moved to Northern Ireland just over 3 years ago. And one of the first things that I wanted to do when I got here was act as a practice teacher. So the Southern Trust have been great, and I'm able to work with the Southern Trust as a practice teacher. And so Linzi and I worked together on her first placement earlier this year. And Linzi and I developed something during her placement that we thought would be useful to share. And Linzi will introduce herself later because we've run through the way that we'd like to do the session. But that's a little bit about me. Please do use the chat if you've got any questions, any comments, any thoughts. We've left time at the end as well for that. But Linzi's going to look at the chat while I'm talking, and then I'm going to look at the chat when Linzi's talking. So we wanted to introduce to you the Supervision Lotus today. It's a new tool that can be used in reflective supervision. We've actually presented it a few times within the Trust, and also I think we went to the Northern Trust, Linzi, didn't we, to present it. And I've also presented it a few times in other countries, and it's always been very popular. So we're hoping that you'll be able to take something away from today. We're going to talk you through the Lotus, where it comes from, and then Linzi will take you through how she developed it specifically for herself during her placement. So I suppose we wanted to start off really just with, I suppose, a nod to the new supervision policy that I'm sure everybody's familiar with. I think it's a great policy, actually. So I do a lot of training on supervision all over the place. And I'm telling everybody about it because I think it's a really good policy. I think it's been put together very well. I think it's very contemporary. I love that idea of the core functions of supervision being professional development, organizational role performance, and personal well-being, and how we bring those together, but also looking at the worker in the center of that, not necessarily getting everything from every supervision session. So we loved the idea of this, and because this came out during Linzi's placement, so we spent some time looking at the supervision policy and thinking about how that also connected into the Lotus that we were developing. I always use in my work the what, why, how framework in everything that I do. I've used this since I was a social work student, actually. I think this is what we do as social workers. So when we're working with somebody, whether it's an adult, a child, an individual, a whole family, we ought to be able to answer fairly easily what's happening for this person. Why has this situation come about? How can I work with them to bring about improved outcomes? Or how do I work with them to safeguard them? Or how do I work with them to maintain the situation? Of course, the how question is going to relate to what's happening. But for me, this is our basic problem-solving framework. What, why, how? I think, though, that the danger is that in contemporary practice, things are so busy. We're in a climate which is really challenging at the moment. I think what's happening is the why question is falling off that signpost, that framework. I think it's much more likely that social workers are going to ask, what's happening? How do I deal with it? What's going on? How do I respond this time? There's a lot of what and how, and I think there is a significant loss of why within the social work profession. Now, we know that, serious case reviews, critical incident reports are telling us there is a loss of professional curiosity within the profession. So we know that. One of the reasons over the years that I have absolutely loved working with students as a practice teacher is because they will often ask the why question. Why do you do it like that, Siobhan? And it kind of makes you think, I think, well, I don't know, I've done it like that for 10 years. I'm not sure. And I think it's one of the great things about working with students is that they can bring that why question. But I've also noticed, I can't say exactly when I noticed it started to happen, maybe 10 years or so ago or so. And when I'm talking at conferences about this, other practice educators, other practice teachers are telling me the same thing. I have noticed students are not asking me why as much now as they used to. I'm getting a lot more, what form do I fill in? How do I do this? What comes next? So I do think there is a lot of what and how in the profession. This is a signpost, and the reason it's a signpost is because it does signpost our journeys, I think, with the people that we seek to support. The why question points in a different direction. And that's because quite often why does take us in different directions. One of my passions and one of the things I write a lot about is social work theory and critical reflection. And that sits in the why question. When we're asking, why is this happening? That's when we're reflecting. It's when we create connections. It's when we connect theory with our practice. It's such an important question. Students sometimes say to me, when I ask, if I'm with a big group of students, I get the privilege of working with large groups sometimes. And sometimes I say to them, why don't you ask why anymore? And they'll say, we think it's a silly question. We think we should know the answer. I mean, firstly, there's no such thing as a silly question, is there? But also, why is in so many ways the most powerful question we can ask. It is the connector question, isn't it? We know, don't we, from child development theory, children go through that stage where they ask why constantly about everything until you've literally got no answer left to give. And that's when they're in that stage of creating connections. So the why question is the connector question. The why question is vital. Now, because this is such an important framework, I'm going to ask you to reflect a little bit during this lunchtime seminar. What I'd like you to do is think about supervision. What we know is the most significant influencer on the supervision that you provide is the supervision that you receive. All of the research tells us that. So I'm going to ask you to think about this from two angles. I'm going to ask you through the session today to think about what kind of supervision do you get? Why is it like that? And how is that impacting on your work? Just for some guided reflection through the session. And then if you also provide supervision, I'm going to ask you to use it in the same way to think about what kind of supervision you provide. Why is it like that? How does it impact on staff, students, the people that they support? Now, this framework, this what, why, how framework, when we lose the why, our practice becomes managerial and bureaucratic. Our practice loses professional curiosity. Perhaps the most dangerous thing is our practice adopts a medical model. You think about it, look at that signpost now. That's the medical model. The medical model is, what's the diagnosis? How do we treat it? What's the prescription? How do we dispense it? There is no why in the medical model. Why is one of the most essential questions that we can ask and use within the supervision arena. There's not a great deal of research about social work supervision, but David Wilkins, who's based at the University of Cardiff, has done a fair amount. And in one of their pieces of research, one of his team's pieces of research, they listened in to 99 audio recordings of social work supervision. Now, it was child protection supervision, but you could draw out of it into every area of practice. Now, to decide whether they thought that the supervision was practice focused. And by that, what they meant was it's not just case management, it's focused on practice, but it brings in that reflection and reflexivity. They considered 3 key questions when they were listening to the audio recordings as part of their research. Do we know what the social worker is going to do in the next home visit or the next few visits with this family? Do we understand why the social worker is going to do those things and how they're going to do it? And at the end of each conversation, they thought about, has this discussion helped the worker to think more carefully about what they're going to do, how they're going to do it, and why they're going to do it? So actually this what, why, how framework is essential within supervision. It's a handy way when you're in practice-based supervision of concluding a conversation by saying, can you just summarize for me your what, why, how? And that can go on to case notes. So the what, why, how framework is very important. Now this guy here, Simon Sinek, he is probably the most influential writer or consultant in the world of leadership at the moment. And we know that there's a leadership strategy we're looking at across Northern Ireland. And, you know, social work is about leadership. Social work from the outset, students can be leaders. You know, Linzi has demonstrated some really positive leadership skills as a first placement student. So this isn't about management, this is about leadership. Now, Simon Sinek has written a really, one of those global best-selling books, you know, the ones you find in airport bookshops and all of that. It's called Start With Why. I'm not recommending it. I don't think it's a great book, certainly for social workers, but this book is really, really famous, really well known in the leadership world. And he's developed what he calls the golden circle. It's one of his theories from the entire leadership model that he's developed, is this golden circle. Now, I think when you're a social worker, you always see things in certain ways, don't you? I look at it and I think, well, that's my what, why, how framework and Neil Thompson's PCS put together, because it looks just like that, doesn't it? It's Neil Thompson's PCS, you know, the 3 circles sitting inside of one another, and the what, why, how framework in a slightly different order. Now, he's talking about organizations, but he says every organization on the planet knows what they do, the products they sell or the services they provide. He says every organization knows what they do. He says that some organizations know how they do it, their unique selling point, the things that set them apart. But his main claim is that very few organizations know why they do what they do. He goes on to say, why isn't about making money? That's the result. Why is a purpose, a cause, a belief? It's the very reason the organization exists. It's almost the mission. He then says that when organizations focus, as they almost always do, on what they do, that is all they will ever be able to do. But when they focus on why they do it, they'll be able to be flexible, and they'll be able to adapt, and they'll be able to keep, you know, contemporary. So it's a really helpful framework, this what, why, how. Just, you know, wanted to introduce it, say I use it a lot in lots of different things. It's really useful in supervision. It's really useful in leadership. But because of this framework, because Simon Sinek says start with why, then that's what we're going to do. Linzi and I are going to present to you the Lotus model. I'm going to start off with why I wanted to work with Linzi on the Lotus model. I'm going to take you through my perspective on it. And then Linzi's going to start off with why she thought the Lotus model would be helpful. And she'll take you through how she developed it as a student, so that you'll get that Lotus model from both angles. Can I just check? There's a little bit of background noise for me. I don't know if anybody's not popped themselves on mute, but if you can just check that, because there's a bit of a background noise there. So one of the reasons why I really wanted to think about bringing something new to my supervision with students, there are probably 2 main threads that were coming together in the work that I do when I'm doing training, and I do a lot of training around supervision. And those 2 things were about being trauma informed within supervision and being neuro-inclusive within supervision. They're really important. I think they're things that we really need to consider as social workers at the moment. Karen Treisman, who you'll know, she does a lot of work here on trauma-informed practice. She describes the ingredients for trauma-informed supervision as being recognizing unique individual experiences, being curious and open, modeling the model, providing a secure base and a safe haven within the supervision environment, safety and trust, self-care, working on strengths, skills, and resiliency, being multisensory, and it needs to be creatively embedded, and meeting the person where they're at. Now, the Lotus model does all of those things, I think, but it's particularly multisensory and creatively embedded. And that's a bit of a passion of mine. I think it's really important to do that and to bring that angle within supervision and into what we do. So there's one of my whys. I wanted to really start to think much more about how I could provide a trauma-informed environment within supervision. I'm very conscious of the moral injury that many students are experiencing at the moment. I think it's quite, I don't know how much work you've done around moral injury, but if you explore moral injury, one of the things that I think is happening is students and newly qualified workers are experiencing moral injury at a really alarming rate at the moment. And that's being addressed in health, and in their preceptorship models, they're really looking at that in health with newly qualified workers. And I think we're not yet fully looking at it in social care. So around moral injury, we really need to think about being trauma informed within our supervision. And there's almost, you could do a whole lunchtime seminar on that, couldn't you? And I'm just trying to give you a little bit of a flavour here of why we wanted to develop this model. I'm also really aware of the need to be neuro-inclusive in supervision. I was involved last year in editing a book. It's been a really popular book called Emergence, and it's hidden narratives from neurodivergent social workers. It's been an incredibly popular book. It's full of narratives from neurodivergent social workers. Now, if you're not familiar with the phrase and the term neurodivergent in terms of explaining that, people in the book, there's people with dyslexia, dyspraxia, Irlen syndrome, frontal lobe, epilepsy, ADHD, autism, brain injury. Something that creates a divergence in terms of our neurotypical thinking. So neurodiversity is really about the fact that we all think differently. Neurodivergence means there's a difference that may need some specific adaptation or particular thought put into it. Now, those narratives from social workers, and that was from students through to probably, I think we had a director of social services in there who was neurodivergent. Those narratives really demonstrated a lot of challenges for social workers, neurodivergent social workers. And for me, I was thinking we really need to think about supervision being much more neuro-inclusive. So the Chartered Institute for Personnel Development has a neuro-inclusion at work guide. It's very new. They keep it really updated. They're very hot on that. So in terms of an explanation of what neuro-inclusivity would mean, they say neurodiversity inclusion or neuro-inclusion involves consciously and actively including all types of information processing, learning, and communication styles. So this is about thinking about the fact that we do all learn differently, we process information differently, and we communicate differently. And they're key aspects of supervision. So we really need to think about diversity within that. I think when I'm working with students, every student that I work with, I hope would have a different experience of supervision. I hope that the supervision that I provide is tailored to their needs and their learning style. So I suppose it's that bit about what do we mean by neuro-inclusivity. So in that Chartered Institute for Personnel Development, this is what they say are the key principles for creating a neuro-inclusive organization. The first principle is the importance of understanding as an organization where you are now and committing to a long-term plan of action. Now, as a practice teacher, I use this to think about me. Where am I now in terms of being neuro-inclusive as a practice teacher? And how can I commit to a long-term plan of action to be more neuro-inclusive in my practice teaching? Focus on creating an open and supportive culture where people feel comfortable talking about neurodiversity. I don't know if you're aware that the largest growing group of social workers in terms of an organised group of social workers in the UK, and I would say probably across Europe at the moment as well, is the UK neurodivergent social worker group. It's massive. You know, this is a big issue at the moment. People are really coming together. Their voices are coming together in terms of experiences as social workers. So though that group is creating this open and supportive culture, but to what extent are we providing that within supervision? Proactively consider neurodiversity in all people management transactions. Allow individual employees to be masters of their own journey. Embrace flexible working to enable everybody to thrive, and practice ongoing attention to well-being whilst empowering neurodivergent voices. Now, you may have noticed as the slides have gone along that I really like to have visual images on my slides. I'm really a visual thinker. I know that. That's an aspect of neurodiversity too, but I'm very much a visual thinker. But I've used the image on this slide to try and demonstrate a little bit of what we might mean by neurodiversity and being neuro-inclusive. So when I think about key principles, as the CIPD describe them, I think of a key like that, a door key. There's a phrase that's very widely used in social work a small key can open a really large door. So I always think of a key like that in a keyhole. But some of you, if I said, what image do you think of when you think of key? Some of you might be musical thinkers. You might think of the keys on a musical instrument. Other people who may be more potentially mathematical thinkers, they might think more of a keyboard like that. It's a bit of an old-fashioned one. Maybe you think more of a keyboard on your laptop, but that was a nicer picture. There's 3 different ways of looking at that key. There's probably more. I'm a visual thinker. Some people are verbal thinkers. Some people are mathematical, musical thinkers. It's a whole different range of thinking styles. And I think one of the problems with social work supervision is we've got so much into, it's just about talking and writing it down. It's very verbally based. I've asked you to think about the kind of supervision you get as well as the supervision you give. What do you see in supervision? Is there any movement within supervision? Do you have anything visual to look at within supervision? Or is it just all, let's talk about it, write it down? We've got so into, in social work, if it's not written down, it didn't happen, that we're so pushed into that verbal form of thinking. For many, many years, I've used prompt cards in supervision around theory, around critical reflection. There's some self-care cards. You can't get hold of those anymore, but I love the self-care cards. There's postcards. I love to have something visual within supervision. Maybe because I'm a visual thinker, but I've found it works well. It opens it up into that different dimension. It builds on things like third object theory, which is Claire Winnicott's ideas, isn't it, around that relationship-based stuff. So all of this comes from a rich history of research and theory, and also much more contemporary stuff around let's be trauma-informed and multisensory and creative. Let's be neuro-inclusive. Now, we can also think about neuro-affirmative approaches. We think a lot in the workplace about being neuro-inclusive, but in practice, we would think much more around neuro-affirmative practice when we're supporting families or individuals. I think maybe as practice teachers, we could even look at neuro-affirmative placements, for example, not just neuro-inclusive, but taking it to that next step on. If you look at the British Psychological Society's research this year, they say neuroaffirmative practice is about support which targets needs and challenges. I think we should be doing that with every staff member, every student we're working with. Recognition of value, that's really important, especially for students. Students often feel quite de-skilled when they come on placement because the whole focus is on what don't you know and what do you need to learn, rather than what are you bringing that you can share with us. We need to have respect for neurodivergent culture and identity, reframe things from a disorder towards a neurotype, a rejection of compliance-based behavior approaches, which is very much more about the actual social work practice, a rejection of neurotypical skills training, stop pathologizing the pathologizing approaches that are used, advocating for systems and environmental changes, fostering positive neurodivergent identity as a parity, and the process of ever becoming. Now, this is more about social work practice, but the first few of those, I think, could be very much about supervisory practice. So that's given a bit of a why, a bit of the background to all of this, what's going on. And then last year, a university in England contacted me to say that a student, Hannah Barnes, whose photo you can see on the screen there, had developed an idea where she needed to do a presentation. So at her university, they have to do a presentation to show fitness to practice before they go on into their second year and their first placement. And she didn't want to do a PowerPoint. She's a neurodivergent student. So she came up with this idea of a box. It's actually, you can buy them, they're called explosion boxes. When you buy them, they're like used a lot for people to put gifts inside. No, the price always goes up around Valentine's Day, I've noticed, because they get used, you know, it's a box inside a box inside a box, that kind of thing. And so she took that and developed it into a presentation at the university, and her university thought this was so good, they contacted me and said, could you work with her to develop it further? So Hannah and I worked together remotely for about 6 months, looking at how it might be further developed. She wrote a chapter in the latest book that I did on reflective practice around the Lotus model and neurodivergence. So she developed this tool. It was really good. We did a short video on it about the tool and what the tool could do. And then another student, Emma, was on placement in a school earlier this year. And she was tasked with, so she was in a school setting, which is a common placement now in England for first placement students, but not really with school social workers, usually in sort of behaviour support teams or pastoral teams within schools. And that's where she was. And she was tasked with, she was asked to support the pupils of the school to reflect. And later, when we spoke about it, she said, Siobhan, it wasn't really about asking them to reflect. It was about telling them, you know, you've not been very good and you need to think about that before you go back in. She said it was like a very childlike, sort of very young childlike approach of think about what you've done and then say sorry and go back in. She said it really wasn't reflection. So she did a lot of work trying to support both the placement team that she was on to think about reflection, but also the students, the pupils there to think about reflection. And she used the Lotus box building on Hannah's idea. It became really popular. There's an article in a newspaper about it in England. It went down really well. The school, the academy used it. And actually then the National Organisation of Practice Teachers asked both Hannah and Emma to present what they'd done at their annual conference earlier this year. So I know both Hannah and Emma. I'd worked with them as they were doing this virtually. But I was thinking, do you know, this would be so useful to adapt for use in supervision. Now, the tool has since been adapted in loads of different ways. I know one of the trusts here in Northern Ireland has adapted the box to be able to use it to talk about what social work is. This is really a way of breaking down a complex issue into something that's understandable and clear for people. So Linzi and I worked together. I kind of just gave her a few thoughts, and I'm sure it was very unclear at the start. Linzi, you'll be able to share that with us. But I think what I was expecting, what I thought might happen, was probably incredibly unclear to Linzi at the start. But Linzi took this idea of the Lotus and we turned it into a tool for supervision. So I'm going to hand over to Linzi now and I'll be able to look at the chat. Linzi's going to tell you a bit about the supervision tool. So it's over to you, Linzi.
Thank you. Hi, yeah, so my name's Linzi and I have just went into my final year of social work and I am doing the relevant graduate route. So it's a 2-year route through social work. And I developed the supervision box alongside Siobhan, who was my practice teacher during my first placement in the Southern Trust. And I also used the development of the supervision tool as part of my community development aspect of placement, viewing student social workers as the community and providing them with a tool to use within supervision or their next placement. So I suppose my why for developing this tool sort of stemmed around challenges for students whenever supervision is first introduced. I found in university a lot of the time the word supervision was used a lot, but it didn't really explore beyond that. So I suppose it created some difficulties around what should good supervision look like, what topics should be covered within supervision, how should I prepare for supervision, and what should I expect from supervision?
And I think we talked about this, didn't we, Linzi, and you felt that there could be quite a bit more done around preparation for supervision for students. And we even talked, didn't we, about if you read a book and prepare for it, the books are almost, it's this thing of, it tells you about it, but you don't really know what it is if you've not experienced it before. And if you took the word supervision away from social work, it absolutely doesn't mean what it is. So if you try looking up in a dictionary, it doesn't give you what it's about, does it? So
yeah, I found there was nothing specific for student social workers to sort of prepare for going into that first placement.
Okay.
So the supervision box itself, I have it here, I suppose, just to show the sort of size of it as well and what it looks like. But I suppose it was developed as a visual tool. I find I'm quite a visual learner and worked well that way as well. And it really helped to structure supervision and to show everything that's involved in supervision just by looking at it. It put it all together in the one place. And the box itself is made up of 5 different layers. So you take the lid off and one by one you see it, or else I suppose it can all be looked at together and how everything, interconnects with each other. And I suppose as well how Emma adapted it for a direct work tool. I think, it would be really great way to use it as well, and to make sure to be neuro-inclusive as well. So in the first layer, or the picture on the left, is the inside lid. And I have placed a feelings and emotions sort of wheel just to make sure that, I suppose, emotional well-being is looked on, and to reflect on how, you've been getting on prior to supervision. And then on the right is topics for discussion. So I suppose things that should be covered in every supervision. So at the top, we have put agenda. So I suppose things that both the student and practice teacher would like to cover within each supervision. And I suppose, again, it just really helps to structure the supervision as well. And then we've got self-care. And then moving around, there's theory and anti-oppressive practice. And within each of these, there's like a little pocket. So I suppose, a specific theory that was spoke about within supervision could be placed into the pocket and, look back upon and how it was used and key points from that. And then we've put in the supervision agreement using Siobhan's supervision chair, which I find really useful as well. And I suppose having it there enables to go back and adjust the agreement if it's needed. And then finally, the supervision folder. So just ensuring that all the contents of the supervision folder are being kept up to date and, being developed as well.
Thank you for that, Lindsay. I'm just going to say it's not my supervision chair, just in case I don't want. So it was Claire Skilleter that developed the supervision chair. So I don't want anybody to think I'm trying to take credit for it, but I get why you said that, Lindsay. So the supervision chair, if people aren't familiar with it, it's really a visual way of doing an agreement. So Lindsay and I did the kind of standard agreement but that feels quite tick boxy. And the supervision chair looks at how do we create a comfortable chair for supervision that you can come and sit in. And it contains questions like to build the legs of the chair, what do you need from me as your supervisor to feel like supervision is going to be stable and predictable? And then the seat of the chair is all about how can we sit comfortably together and learn more about one another. So Lindsay and I talked about, each of us and found out a little bit more about one another. And the back of the chair is about what will keep us sitting upright, what kind of rules and ground rules did we need. The arms of the chair are about how do you create an emotionally containing space within supervision. And then it also talks about reviewing the chair and different aspects of it's really just a way of looking at the agreement. But we had the supervision chair in as a topic for discussion because we might review it. Now with Lindsay, we only reviewed the supervision chair a few times through the whole placement, I think, Lindsay, didn't we? Maybe that was because we were building the supervision box, so we were talking a lot about how supervision was going. Maybe it was because you were very quick to understand supervision and engage in supervision. There might be some students where we would want to review the agreement almost every session. How comfortable did the chair feel for you today? Is there any other part of the chair that we need to think about and spend more time on next time? So when Lindsay and I were looking at the first layer, we very much wanted the first layer to be about what kinds of things should we expect to be talking about in supervision. And so we worked together on what we thought should go into each supervision session. And that's what went into the first layer, wasn't it, Lindsay? But that's a bit of an explanation of the chair, because not everyone will know the chair, Lindsay. So.
And it did work really well, the supervision chair, because I felt like it was a very two-way, approach as well to agreeing. And as well, in that little pocket itself, the supervision agreement is placed in there as well, so you could take it out and look at it.
Okay, so shall I take you to layer 2, Lindsay? There you go.
So then the second layer of the box, I placed 6 models of reflection, including the reflective onion, the big 6, Gibbs reflective cycle, the 4 Fs, me, my, more, must, and you, your, yet, yes, and the head, heart, and hands. And I suppose these 6 were chosen as they were ones that I wanted to explore throughout supervision and my first placement. And then alongside them, I've put 2 cards. So one of them, an explanation of how each reflective model works, and another card to just note down any key reflections as well whenever they were spoken about.
See, I think this is a really important layer, really, isn't it? Because these were the different models that we used. So that we started off very much, didn't we, looking at Gibbs, because you were familiar with Gibbs, you'd learned about Gibbs at university. But then we chose which other models we wanted to use. And I can't remember how. I think I suggested some of them. I think you suggested some of them that you wanted to work on. And then these were the ones that we would use, and we would use different ones for different things. So I remember you did your midpoint, didn't you, using, was it the 4 Fs, or was it, I remember the scenario used, or was it me, my, more, must?
I think it's head, heart, hands, actually.
Was it? But there you go then. That's me, forgotten. But we did use different models to look at different scenarios. And I think that's a really good thing as a practice teacher to do with students, is to encourage them to think about a range of different models of reflection, because different models work in different situations and work for different people. And I think what it enabled Linzi to do was to become really much more reflective and thoughtful around it, around reflection. And there was much more depth, I think, to the reflections. They gave us a structure so that it wasn't just let's have a chat about it. It had a clear structure, and Linzi would know which structure we might use next week, or we could share that. So now I had the idea. I'm going to tell them now, Linzi is obviously very good at artwork. If I had have developed this box, it would not look as beautiful as Linzi has made the box look. But I was saying at the beginning, each time we've used a model, and especially when we get to the further layers, I was like, each time we've discussed that, you could stick a little sticker on it, and then at the end of the placement you'd have, like, you know, oh, that one's got loads of stickers on it, we used it loads. Linzi did not want to do the stickers. She didn't say no, but it became quite clear to me that no, she thought that might make it look a bit messy. I wonder if it's also, Linzi, it meant you could take it on and use it with other people and show them, rather than it being just about your placement. So that is just, I would throw that in. Should we go to layer 3, Linzi?
Yeah.
You okay with that?
Mm-hmm.
There we go.
So the third layer of the box is around Stan Houston's reflective practice and his 5 domains, which are psychobiography, relationships, culture, organisation, and politics and economy. And then the 6th domain of power, just on how it interconnects with all of them. And then there's just a wee quote from Stan that says, combined, these domains explore human meaning and experience. They suggest a person is not just an individual psychological being. More than that, he or she is thrust into the world of social. In this context, identity is a social process deeply influenced by significant others. These tenets lead to the importance, or rather vital necessity, of relationship-based social work. So I suppose it kind of brought in that relationship-based social work and that dynamic of power. And, you know, I used Stan Houston's reflective model during one of my assignments as well, and it really helped to be speaking about it throughout supervision, you know, and understand it and have those conversations and exploring it.
See, I think what was really helpful here is moving to Northern Ireland. You know, that's when I became aware. I kind of knew of Stan Houston's model before I moved here, but I'd not really used it in depth. And I'd used it in supervision previously with students. But when Linzi and I developed the box, I think it does mean that we didn't use the box by looking at, oh, look, now we're going to discuss this, now we're going to discuss that. But almost at the end, you could open it out, say, well, we have talked about this, we have talked about that. And it kind of shows everything that's come together. So I think having the layer a separate layer with Stan Houston, because we talked about putting Stan Houston's model in one of the last layer that we looked at, into layer 2, but we decided to give it a layer of its own because it was one that Linzi was particularly looking at utilising, but also because of the Northern Irish context, we thought that would be really helpful to drill into that one more, so to give it its own layer. But there are 6 bits on the explosion box, aren't there, on the basic box that we got, so we added in that power, but it is in the model, isn't it, as a connector.
Yeah.
Did you want to say anything else, Linzi, or do you want to go to layer 4?
I think it was important. Wasn't, you know, we're going to look at this today and this one next supervision. It was almost looked at after, you could see where everything fit. Do you know, when it made so much more sense to piece it together that way?
Because when you start to think about it, there's a lot of complex issues here that we're talking about. When you're on a first placement, you come into social work for that first time, there are a lot of complex issues, and helping it to be clear to you is useful. Okay, if we'll go to layer 4 then. There's layer 4.
So in layer 4, we've got the social work key roles, or a matrix, and I suppose it just enabled that link to apply your learning to each of the key roles. Every supervision was really important. And I think through speaking to other students, they had said that was one part of their supervision that maybe wasn't looked at each time, you know, how it brought back to the key roles and how they were meeting the standards as well.
And this was the one where I was saying, oh, let's put stickers on. Wasn't I was like, every time we've talked about it and you've got some evidence of it, we could stick stickers on here. And because I thought that'd be really good, because you kind of get an overview. I still feel I might do that if I was to do this again, is to put some stickers on, because you'd get an overview then of, there's loads of evidence. We've got lots of evidence for, I don't know, key role 5, but we've not yet got lots of evidence for this key role, or so actually some way of doing that. Because when you get to the inner parts of the box that we used, because we pre-bought the box, although you have to make it up, don't you? And it took a while, Linzi. I don't know if it took you. When I was making one, it took me ages to make it. But when you get to the middle layers, there's no pocket, is there? There's pockets on the outer layers, but the inner layers, there was no pocket, was there? So you couldn't jot anything in there or write it down. But I suppose you had the matrix. So at this point, it was really about, have we spoken about the matrix today, really, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think the stickers would work well on that layer now. You know, looking back on it, I think I would have done that differently and placed a sticker to know which one needs more focus on the next time.
You could maybe do that in your next placement, Linzi.
Yeah.
Because I think it would give a very visual way of looking at the evidence that you've generated. And then if we go to the final layer then. So
then the final layer on the right hand side of this picture, I suppose it's the lid. On the inside of the lid, we've got the satisfactions, learning dissatisfactions. And this is something that Siobhan would have asked me at the end of each supervision, and it would have been the first thing that popped into my head. And I found the learning question really, really helpful to reflect on the key learning throughout my supervision and be able to look back on that. And then within the box, I've placed some affirmations and quotes just to end supervision on a positive note, really.
If I just say, see, as a practice teacher, I really like to use that method. It's a method taken from a model of direct observation, actually, but it's about how to conclude an activity with a student in a reflective way. Just 4 words: surprises, satisfactions, dissatisfactions, learning. So as Linzi said, I would always end supervision with that. One of the reasons for that, and what I find is really helpful, is what surprises a student in the first couple of weeks of placement doesn't surprise them by the middle of the placement, and by the end of the placement they've forgotten they were even surprised by that in the first place. So it helps you to see growth and progress and go back, because you've got those standard things at the end of every supervision session. So I really like to end it like that. But the supervision chair, one of the things the chair talks about is getting in and out of the chair. So as part of that getting in and out conversation, Linzi and I talked about what will help us both to settle into the chair at the beginning. So how do we want to start supervision, and what will help us to leave the chair and feel comfortable as we're leaving. And Linzi said, oh, I really like to end things with an affirmation or a quote. And I'm not sure I would have known that about you, Linzi, until we'd got much further down the line, other than doing the chair conversation that we had. But then we decided that we would have some affirmations and quotes in the middle of the box, and that would be like sitting at the middle, but the inside of that lid, because there's something in the inside of all the lids as well, isn't there? So do you want to go to the feedback that you got, Linzi, and share some of that?
Yeah, so then I got some feedback on the box from another student, Kelsey, and my personal tutor, Danielle. So Kelsey had said the supervision box is a practical tool that not only helps to structure supervision sessions, but also provides materials to facilitate discussions surrounding different aspects of PLO. I strongly believe that using the supervision box can provide a unique, creative and enjoyable way to ensure both students and practice educators get the most out of supervision. And my personal tutor, Danielle, had said, I thought the supervision box was really innovative, and I was impressed by the co-production element of it so far, as it really puts the student at the heart of the supervision process, helping to break down the potential perceived power imbalance between practice teacher and student.
Okay, so I think, as Linzi said, she used it as part of her community development, and you showed it to quite a few students, didn't you? And we shared it with quite a few people, and we'd perhaps do some of it differently. And we know we'd like to know what your thoughts are about it as well, as we get to the end. But did you want to? Well, we've already said to you, Linzi loves ending on a quote. So this is Linzi's quote for the end of her part of the presentation.
Yeah, so just a quote from Helen Keller, alone we can do so little and together we can do so much.
I think it's great that Linzi really likes to end on a quote, and it was a challenge for me because I then tried to end like the final report and the direct observations with a quote, and it really gave me a challenge. It was an interesting way of us thinking about different communication styles. So we wanted to share the box with you, tell you a little bit about it, but also for today's session, we got together at the weekend to talk about the slides and what we were going to present today. And we thought it might be an idea to put together also some conclusions or recommendations. We've shared the box with you. We'd love to hear your thoughts or answer any questions. We've seen some in the chat, so we'll go through those. But these were some of the recommendations that we thought. I think, Linzi, you were going to do the first three, were you? And I was going to do the next. Is that right?
Yeah. So I suppose a big one would be around more training or learning around supervision for students prior to going out in the first placement. My personal tutor actually had given some feedback around, how possibly using creating a supervision box as part of a PDD day, and creating their own. So I think that would be really useful. And the second one, a supervision policy specifically for students. So similar to the one that was introduced in March by the Department of Health, but specifically for students, social workers, and more resources around preparing for supervision could help people get more out of their supervision. And again, I suppose it was just before I had started my first placement, I was searching for resources and information online, and it was just really difficult to find anything to try and do that preparation.
And then, thank you, Linzi. And then I thought that, that we are hopeful that the new supervision policy will lead to a wider variety of methods in supervision. It refers to group supervision. I do think that we could bring some more contemporary methods into supervision. I know change can be challenging, and that was something I think you actually wanted to add that part there, Linzi, as well, didn't you? That change can be challenging. But I do think that we could be more contemporary in what we do within supervision. This is where I'm going to show myself up now. I didn't even put any photos in because it's so bad, but this is a version, and if I can see my own camera, this is a kind of version of the box, but this is for teams, for group supervision. Look, mine is much more tatty and it's got bits falling off it. I don't have the artistic skills that Linzi has, but when you open it up, inside the box, there are development activities, reflective activities, team care activities, and case discussion activities. So all of these that could be used within, so there's different layers. It's a slightly different version of an explosion box, but these could be used in group supervision. And I know I've been working with a few teams who've developed their own box for group supervision, for example. So something that's visual but can also be used to store things that group supervision has happened that has happened in group supervision could be helpful. I also think, where we started, I gave that explanation of the why. I think we do need to think about being more trauma-informed and neuro-inclusive within supervision. I think that can be a challenge, and we do need to really explore how we're doing that and have some specific thinking and structure around that. I think it's very easy to say we are trauma informed. What does that actually mean? What does that look like? How are staff experiencing that within supervision? And we also think that the Lotus really is a tool that could be used in a whole variety of different ways, because essentially it just provides a way of looking at layers or systems. It's really systems theory in a box. That is really what it is. When you break it down, it is just about looking at the different layers in something. So you could use it as a tool to explore anything which is complex. And there are lots of different versions of explosion boxes that you can get. It's an unfortunate phrase that's what they're called, but that's, if you needed to Google it or find one, that's what you would do. Because I've had some people email me saying I've been Googling to try and find a Lotus box and I can't. Well, it was actually just called a box by Hannah originally, or an explosion box. After her thoughts about it and the development of it, she decided it was very much more about growth, and so she wanted to call it a lotus. So it's like a lotus flower. So we have got some time for comments, reflections, questions. We'll have a look at what's in the chat and try and answer the questions. But also Linzi has been really thoughtful and put all of the references to the models that we used there. And I also just wanted to share with you, I don't normally recommend my own books, but this one has got Hannah's chapter about the Lotus model in it. It's a book from this year. Lots of ideas about trying to bring reflective practice up to date. Because one of the things that I would say, and we had a conversation about, Linzi and I, about models of reflection, is a lot of the models of reflection that are used have been around since the 1980s. Most people still are making references to Schoen's 1983 book. Yes, it was a pivotal text. Yes, it was really important. But we've got to look at, have things been kept up to date? You know, I've been around since the 1980s. There's nothing wrong with being around since the 1980s. But if I was wearing my 1980s hairstyle and my 1980s clothes, still, it wouldn't go down very well. And I think that's one of the things, is we've got to think about things being more contemporary. So I think Linzi's done an amazing job of sharing the Lotus. Linzi did an amazing job of building the Lotus, which is why I was saying earlier, leadership isn't just about management. You can have leadership from first-year students. So I think you've done a really great job as well, Linzi, because it could be a bit nerve-wracking, we were saying, a lot of people, but you've done a great job. So shall we try and go and have a look? Robin, if you want to pick some out, Linzi, you pick some out. I've just gone to the top. I'm just going to look down. Robin, you're quite right. You put, when I was trained many years ago, we were told not to use why, as it's too aggressive and confrontational. I would agree with you, Robin. And I was taught that as well. One of the things that I would say, and I should have said when I was talking about the what, why, how framework, is I would use why a lot more with other professionals in supervision, in meetings with other professionals. I would use why more sparingly when I'm actually working with, I don't like the phrase, but service users or the people that we work with. I would use why less often there, because it can come across as aggressive. It can come across as quite judgmental. You know, why did you do that? Can be quite judgmental and can shut conversations down sometimes. But I'm not saying I would never use it, but I would use it more sparingly. I would use it very often, though, with other professionals. So that was just a reflection on Robin's thought there. So, Lindsay, were there any questions you saw that you'd like to answer? Or...
Just Wendy at the end there had asked if I'd used it for community development or group work, and it was community development, sort of seeing the community as student social workers. So
yeah, we did talk, didn't we, to your supervisor and your tutor about it, because I was concerned about, because it was a very new tool and we were looking at how to develop it. I thought this is a lot of work to ask a student to do if they're not being given some time within placement to do. So we agreed it was used as your community development, because you did meet with people to look at what should go in there. You did share it at the end. You also linked with Hannah and Emma, the two students that we talked about at the beginning, didn't we? So that's how we managed to use it as community development. And then the author of the supervision chair, Francis, has asked, it's Claire Skilleter. What I could do, I don't know if this is possible, Alison, but I could send that to you. There's a template, or I'll send you the reference. It might be that it's worth actually asking Claire if she'll do a lunchtime seminar on it, because it is really helpful, as Lindsay said, and we've only touched on it.
okay.
But I could send you at least a link, but it's Claire Skilleter, and the book it's in is called Creative Approaches to Practice Education, but I will send the formal link out to you. So Judith's asking how it was recorded in the supervision folder. Yes, I did take minutes, as we traditionally would. I would still like us to look at different ways of recording supervision, because it doesn't all have to be, but that was a bit too much to go for it all at once. So it might be like the next stage on. But yes, we did do supervision notes. I would say I didn't do them maybe as extensively as I would have done without the box, because there were some notes and Lindsay made notes that she put into the box. So, okay. Are there any other questions? It doesn't look like there's any other questions in the chat. So Alison, I don't know if normally you open things up for questions, or not sure.
Yes, we've got time. If anyone has any specific questions they'd like to ask, yes.
I think it can be difficult to, when Lindsay and I have presented before, you've actually bought the box, haven't you, Lindsay? And people have been able to open it and look around. So I don't know how well it translates when you can't actually see it. But just hoping people got an idea of what we created and how it could be utilized. So okay, I don't know if there is anything else then, Alison. Everybody's very quiet. Maybe we could conclude.
Sorry, Siobhan, could I?
Oh yes, Jerry, yes, sorry.
Sorry,
Yes.
Siobhan. I was looking for somewhere to put my hand up and I couldn't find it on this laptop. So apologies for cutting in on you. No, I just wanted to thank yourself, Lindsay, for presenting it. Very, very interesting, very useful, I think. Just what was striking me, and I thought I'd put a question up, but just covering so many models of reflection, getting your head into those different models, and how challenging that was, Lindsay, to take that on board, and then how you decide which ones to go with, or what did that feel like, or if that's clear.
No, I suppose within university it was always sort of Gibbs, that's where it was found, and I actually find that quite narrowing and it kind of restricted, because it didn't always make sense in using Gibbs. But I suppose, maybe it was more after something was spoke about in supervision, we'd see which model it would fit in, and it would you'd understand it from a real life learning experience as well. But I suppose as well with other students and developing a box, you could use less reflective models. It's very individual as well, and how it could be used.
Right, yeah. Well, thanks for that, Lindsay.
Sorry, Jerry. I was just going to say, I found Lindsay was very open to the use of lots of different models, and some students haven't been. And I also think that, sometimes I'm quite critical of Gibbs generally. I'd use it in some situations, but I think it can be very much just about a single incident. You can't look at the bigger picture. It's more difficult to analyze. So But I also see that there is value in it, especially for a first placement student, because it does give a very clear step-by-step structure and way of working on things. So I would say that the first couple of times Linzi and I reflected, we definitely used Gibbs because it was something that Linzi was familiar with. But then I think that the way it happened was there was something where Linzi was talking about feelings, probably as part of Gibbs. And I said, look, there's another model here, the 4S, which is facts, findings, feelings, futures. And we could maybe use that. And then it went from there. And then Linzi was like, oh, so I can see how that would work. And then she went off to find some others, and we kind of built it in that way.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, I think not all students are ready for that, but some are. And I think it is important that we open it out, especially when we think about neurodivergence, because essentially a model of reflection is telling us how to think, isn't it? And we don't all think in the same way, and we shouldn't all be made to think in the same way. So there should be a variety of models available, I think.
Thanks very much, Siobhan. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Jerry. I just put into the chat, I don't know if it made sense because I was trying to type it quickly, but I was thinking, we used to end our supervision sessions, Linzi and I, as she explained, with the words surprises, satisfactions, dissatisfactions, learning. Now, it's not a question. I wouldn't say to Linzi, what have been your surprises this week? I would just say the word. And Linzi I always said to Linzi, she was very good at preparing for supervision, but I would always say to Linzi, don't prepare for that. Just go for whatever is the first thing that comes out. If I say surprises, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? And then Linzi would share that. So if I were to say to you, maybe we could do that in the chat. If you think about the lunchtime seminar that we've had, and then you think about the word surprises, is there anything that comes to mind? If you think about the word satisfactions, is there anything that comes to mind? If you think about the word dissatisfactions, what comes to mind? You think about the word learning, is there anything that comes to mind? And you could maybe just use the chat to share some of that with us. That might be good as well for Linzi to see how other people use that. I'm seeing a coping with moral injury seminar would be great. Yeah, I could talk to Alison about that, or there may be other people you'd want to do that, Alison. But Judith, thank you. Yeah, how simple the Lotus model felt. I think that's the thing. When you take something layer by layer, it does feel simple, but there is also a lot of complexity to it when you put it all together. I think when you see the Lotus at the end, the final picture that Linzi showed, it looks like actually you've done loads in this supervision session, and it helps students to see how much has been covered within supervision session. So thank you. We can see some other things from some other surprises and satisfactions from people. Maybe just give a minute or two for us to capture some of those, but we'll hand over back to you. And I don't know, Linzi, if you want to say anything, but I would say thank you to people for coming. Thank you to Linzi for doing the session. It's a big deal to do something like this when you're a student, and you've done it really confidently. So thank you, Linzi. And thank you, Alison, for allowing us to share with it. So, Linzi, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, just a big thank you for everyone who joined and came along to listen.